All right. Okay. So let's go back to talk about where you grew up and all that.
Sure. So I was born in New York City on May 3rd, 1960, and grew up on the Upper East Side, but way east, so not the fashionable part of the Upper East Side. My father was a born and bred New Yorker, which is unusual, and my mother had moved to New York as a young mother with a child from a previous marriage. Um, my father waited till, it's more common now, but he was almost 50 when I was born. So I grew up and my mother was in her late 30s. So I grew up with older parents who, had established careers and pretty full lives. Both of them were writers, but probably to somewhat frustrated writers. And my father worked in public relations and did some political consulting. My mother eventually became an artist, and they were both, had a lot of political consciousness and social justice consciousness, did some work in the anti-war effort, a little bit of work in the civil rights effort. But mostly I would say I grew up in a household that was very culturally and politically aware.
Okay, hold on. I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to stop for just one sec. Okay. Okay. So take us from. So went through high school in New
Right.
York
I
City.
went through elementary school and high school in New York City, and when it was time for me to go to college, I went to the University of Chicago. I suppose I followed in my mother's footsteps, but for whatever reason, I didn't think of it that way. I think I felt like I was charting a new path and rejecting all the kind of Ivy League, New England kind of life that most of my classmates were choosing. So I ended up at the University of Chicago and studied humanities. At the time, I was good at science, so I thought I was going to go to med school, and I did all the pre-med requirements. I worked in the emergency room at the University of Chicago, which I hear is the model for the show ER. I don't know if it's true, but it was quite a wild place in the 80s. But somewhere around my senior year, I decided that I did not want to go to medical school after all. And sometimes I think that my taste for journalism and storytelling, um, well, it came to a large extent from my parents, because they weren't journalists, but that was especially my father. He was a real raconteur. But I think some of it came from working in that emergency room on weekend nights on the south side of Chicago, and meeting, there was heavy trauma, lots of poverty, lots of people coming in because they didn't have access to any other kind of doctor. Um, and I met a lot of people and was around all kinds of situations that I wouldn't normally have encountered as a college student.
So what led to the journalism? So that, I mean, that's a dumb. But in other words, so did you
No,
began?
it didn't really. I was very confused in my early 20s about what I wanted to do. And I worked for a year at the University of Chicago in their budget office, and through that, landed a job back home in New York City with New York City's budget office, and thought I was going to go into like government or public policy or something. But I really hated working in bureaucracy, and I was just really confused. And I finally landed on journalism because I thought it seemed creative. I liked the idea of producing something every day, of not being connected to it, so attached to an office. And I applied for whatever reason. I was very young and naive. I applied to one journalism school, Columbia. And then somebody told me, had a friend who taught there, and I called her up to ask her advice, and she was really mean to me. She said, Columbia is really hard to get into, and I can't believe you only applied to one school, and what you really need to do is get a job in journalism. And I said, well, I don't have any experience. And she said, well, you should go and get a part-time job with the Gannett newspapers in Westchester County. So I applied there, and when I filled out the application, it said, do you have a car? Because a car was required for the job. So I said yes, which of course I didn't have a car. Nobody in New York City has cars. And then I got the job, and it was going to start the following week. It was a part-time job that paid $5.25 an hour. That was my first journalism job. And I needed a car, and a friend of mine had a friend who lived in New Jersey who had this ancient Gremlin, which was a 3-speed AMC car, and I didn't know how to drive a stick shift, so I learned to drive the stick shift on the way back from New Jersey into Manhattan. I mean, it was just a cuckoo thing to do. And so I worked at the job I had part-time that summer, and at these newspapers in Westchester County. It was the New Rochelle Standard-Star, the Mamaroneck Times, and the Larchmont. I don't remember what the Larchmont paper was. And I had another friend who lived in New Rochelle, so her parents let me park the car in their driveway. And that's really how I started in journalism, was reporting on crimes and these other things they would send me to in Westchester County. And I remember it was my first week there. I didn't know what to do. Like, I didn't know how to write a lead of a news story. And I'd gone to collect, whatever little crimes had happened. And I was sitting at my desk staring at the computer terminal, and the guy across from me said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I don't know how to start." And he said, "Well, it's easy. You just look at today's crime blotter and copy the format. It's not that hard." And it was really useful advice in learning how to write in a news style. But then it turned out I got into Columbia, so I started at Columbia, which was a one-year program. So I did that for a year and graduated in 1987, and then needed a job. And so again, I was kind of behind what everybody else was doing. And what I did was every day, we had figured out that this was in the day before cell phones, and long distance calls still cost money. And we'd found that there was some phone line in a dean's office at Columbia that had a long distance line on it. So every day I'd go back to Columbia and I'd just start writing newspapers all around the country, and finally landed an interview, I think at the Roanoke Times. And when I landed an interview in the Roanoke Times, then I called up all these other newspapers, including the Winston-Salem Journal, and said something like, "I'm going to be in the area, can I come and see you?" And so that's what I did, and that's how I landed at the Winston-Salem Journal. I got a job. They hired me into the Davidson County Bureau, and I started there in July of 1987.
And so how long did you work? So what was Lexington like as a northerner?
Yeah. Well, Lexington, I don't think I'd ever, until I went on that job hunt, which took me to Virginia, North Carolina, and West Virginia. I don't even think I'd been to Washington, D.C. except once, as a small child, to go to the Smithsonian. So I'd probably never been south of New Jersey or Philadelphia, maybe Philadelphia. So it was, and then instead of living in Winston-Salem, I moved to a little apartment in downtown Lexington, North Carolina. So it was absolute culture shock. It was stranger, if I had moved to a big city in Europe, or probably not Asia, but if I'd moved to any other big city or a big city in Europe, the culture shock would have been less than moving from Manhattan to Lexington, North Carolina. So it was well, no, it isn't anymore, but it was a furniture producing town, so I'd never even had an experience of, a town organized around a single industry like that. It was, I'd lived in a small town that we spent our summers in upstate New York in a small town. So I had experience of rural America, small town America. But Lexington was really, it was like going back in time, probably 20 or 30 years. So it was really interesting to me. The things that stuck out right away were, well, the segregation was not new to me because I'd gone to school in Chicago. So Chicago is an incredibly segregated city. But what things were really striking immediately? Well, the symbolism of, I'd never seen a Confederate flag before. So all the remnants of the Civil War, and the fact that people still wanted to talk about it, and people still treated me as though, I was a Yankee, and people wanted to talk about race in the South straight off the bat. Also, the fact that everybody belonged to a church and was Christian, and people would ask me what I was, and people did not know what a Jew was. Like, they thought it was like being a Catholic. So no experience, it just was, I was such a foreign entity. And, I talked too fast. I just was so stuck out. The guy who'd had the job before me, I think it was always guys who'd had that job. So the guy who'd had it before me was this tall, skinny, handsome guy with beautiful brown eyes who went on to a paper in Florida. So all the secretaries who he'd spent 2 years charming up, they never got over him, and they just missed him so much because he was such a sweetheart, I suppose. Other things that hit me right away was kind of, I knew about urban poverty, but not small town or rural poverty. But yeah, this attachment that was all around me to this earlier era, and I suppose still to, the Civil War, this other period of time that all of that was really new and surprising to me.
So how long were you in Lexington?
2 years.
And, in terms of race,
Mm-hmm.
some of the stories you covered.
Yeah, so that, I got interested in all of that right away. Let me see, my first big story that got me on the front page out of Lexington had nothing to do with race. It was about cruising on Main Street. But it, the Winston-Salem Journal had really great reporters, and drew reporters from all over the country when I started there in '87. So there were a lot of reporters doing big stories, and also, working really hard at developing sources, and working really hard at sort of immersive kinds of reporting. So the way I did the reason this cruising story landed me on the front page is I went cruising. I was 27, but I looked a lot younger. So I went cruising with all these kids in Lexington. So it was, it was a really lively story. I did a lot, there was a lot of crime, so I did a lot of crime stories, and the the sheriff's office was, I'd never had an experience of that either. The sheriff's office, really, the sheriff really controlled the county politically. So that was all brand new to me, and just how colorful the people and the characters were. So the sheriff was a Democrat, a guy named Paul R. J. Bird McCrary, and it was the year Dukakis ran for president, and one of the stops he made was Davidson County to be shown around by the sheriff, because the sheriff was a powerful figure. The DA was also a Democrat, conservative, but the Republican Party hadn't yet assumed power in North Carolina, so conservatives were Democrats still in the late 80s. And he also went by, a nickname. He was H.W. Butch Zimmerman. And so I had a lot of exposure to covering crime in the courts. I think the first story I did that really dealt with race in a clear way, race and poverty, was a story about a section of Lexington which was inside the city but still had no sewage or running water. And I got that by getting to know the city planning director, and the city was going to apply for a federal grant to finally run sewage lines to this neighborhood. And so I went out there, and it was so impoverished. It was the kind of little area that you could imagine maybe in the Delta, but really it looked like something out of the Haiti or someplace like that. And it was old people. They seemed, I interviewed a number of people. Everybody seemed, mentally disabled in one way or another. It was just a completely neglected, impoverished place. So I think that was the first story I did that really dealt with, the question of race and poverty.
And what was the response to the article? From what you could gather.
I don't remember. The city was already, it wasn't as though I had exposed it.
Right.
The city was already about to deal with it, so it didn't lead to anything. But it ran on the wire. I think that was the first story I did that got picked up by AP and ran, in other newspapers. So I think people were shocked that in North Carolina, a community inside a city, it wasn't rural, that people were still living with those kind of conditions.
Okay, stop for just 1 second.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so that was, it's kind of interesting learning how, as a reporter, it must have been exciting to get when you got your first piece that got picked up by AP.
Yeah, it was exciting. Yeah, it was really exciting. I'm trying to think. The whole environment was so, race and racism was always a question. I didn't actually hear a lot of, people were pretty careful in front of me not to use the N-word or not to say something that was clearly racist, but it was clearly I want to take some of that back. The furniture industry, it was clearly a community where racism was prevalent, but on the other hand, the furniture industry, for example, was the workforce was black and white, and so there was a lot of interaction among black people and white people. The the city council had, there were black wards and white wards, and the city council had 2 or 3 black city council members who I got to know well. One of them in particular made a big impression on me. Her name was Annetta Beverly, and she was just one of these really strong community leaders. I saw her recently, and she now lives in Greensboro, and I think she was a minister then, and she is now, and she's become, quite a well-established figure locally. But at the time, she was just an incredibly strong community activist, and there were I don't remember other figures like that in Lexington, but I got this exposure to grassroots African American leadership while I was working in that role there.
I have a question. In other words, back then, kind of looking back at the glory days of journalism, you were saying that the Journal attracted top reporting talent from across the country. I mean, how many reporters were there? And now it's like...
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was just... Well, first of all, it attracted really top talent from across the country. It also retained... North Carolina has always had a strong journalism school at UNC, and so there were always really good journalists here, and they stayed. And so the generation ahead of me were really, really talented writers and journalists and reporters and editors. And then, my group came from, my generation came from all over the place. I'm trying to think. So we had a bureau in Washington, D.C. at the time. We had 2 people in Raleigh permanently. We had 5 or 6 bureaus around the northwest part of the state. We had, I can't remember how many reporters, but there was an education reporter, a higher education reporter, an environmental reporter, 4 business reporters, a city hall reporter, a county reporter, 2 or 3 cop reporters, a court reporter, plus a federal court reporter, plus, a religion reporter, plus a very large features staff that had arts reporters, a book editor, classical music reporter, popular music reporter, 4 or 5 general assignment writers on the features desk. It was a big, robust, vibrant place. And a lot of people to learn from. And, it was a fun group of people to be around.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
The glory days. Now, what, there's 6? It's sad. It's unbelievable.
Very small, yes.
More,
7, and a couple of editors, some good people there, but it wasn't the kind of robust place that it was when I started. We competed with the Charlotte Observer and the Raleigh News and Observer, but I was also, in my head, trying to, if it was a regional story, or I moved to the business desk after Davidson County, and in my head I was competing with the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times because we were covering the same stories. We covered tobacco and banking and transportation and the merger of Piedmont Airlines and US Airways. And yes, in my head, those were the newspapers I was trying to get a scoop on.
Tell that story about the DA.
Oh, yeah. So the DA in Davidson County, I covered all the major crimes, trials and so on, and knew him pretty well. He actually lived like a couple of blocks away from me, and he liked all these public officials liked the interaction with the newspaper and wanted it. So, and also I had to talk to him to find out, you know, what was coming up, what cases were coming up and all of that. And so I would, and part of my beat, you know, I would drop into the DA's office at least once a week. Every morning I went to the sheriff's office. Every morning I went to the police department. It was a completely hands-on way of doing reporting. And so when I would drop into the DA's office, if it was a Friday, I suppose I'd go and, you know, I knew all the lawyers who hung around the DA's office, and I remember at least once sitting in his office and then getting sort of other people would come in, so I was sort of like, couldn't get out because I was, you know, other people were crowding around the door. And, you know, he had all this like Civil War paraphernalia up on the walls and portraits and muskets and stuff like that. And yeah, he would read, at least once I heard him read from, I think they were slaveholder diaries, reading these kinds of sexual exploit passages. And I don't remember, it's a very dim memory, except that I was obviously completely uncomfortable. And I don't know if the other lawyers were uncomfortable too, but you know, you had to kind of buddy up to the DA if you wanted to either be a reporter or be a lawyer in Davidson County. So everybody just sort of buddied up to him.
Mm. Wow. So then that you were in Lexington for 2 years, and then did you move to here?
Oh, well, I have another story about the DA to give you a sense of the climate. So at one point in my first year there, I had some kind of altercation with the clerk of court over getting access to the court files while a trial was going on, and which are public record, and I would need to see them to check the dates and spellings and all that kind of thing. And somehow or other, I got one of the clerks to show me one of the files that the head clerk of court wanted to be kept, I don't know, and kept away while court was in session. And she grabbed my notebook from me. And so I called my editor, and he said, well, I suppose we better talk to Butch Zimmerman about this. He'll straighten it out. And my editor came down and met me, and we went into Butch Zimmerman's office. And Butch Zimmerman said, well, you know, she's so pushy. You know, you send a Yankee in to cover us. Like, what do you think is going to happen? And my editor looked around his office and looked at all that Civil War stuff and said, well, I don't know about her being a Yankee, but last time I was in her office, she didn't have any portraits of Ulysses S. Grant hanging on her wall. So maybe we can just move on and figure out how to get her notebook back, or however we resolved it, and figure out a procedure so that while court is in session, she can have access to the court files during the lunch break.
So that's quite a story.
Yes.
Wow. So, okay. So moving on to, you moved to Winston?
I moved to Winston, and they moved me, and I really wanted, after 2 years, it's isolating working in a bureau. I mean, it was just me and the guy who was in charge of circulation, and his girlfriend, who most of the time hung around his office eating candy. I mean, that was my work environment. And so the first job that opened up in the newsroom was on the business desk. So I moved to Winston and covered, you know, all kinds of really interesting business stories.
And what year was that you moved back here?
Probably 89.
89. Okay, so to take us then up to the whole Daryl Hunt thing.
Right. So you know, I did lots of different beats at the Journal over the next 12, 13 years. I covered poverty for a while. They had that as a beat, and then that didn't last. I covered city hall and local politics, which had me covering housing and neighborhoods and not crime, but policy. I covered health care for about 4 years, which had me covering both public health, local health, the business of health, research, all kinds of things, including infant mortality, which was a big story and had a lot to do with race and systemic racism. Then I was the city's metro columnist, so I did that for 2 years. And then that's how I got into the story of Daryl Hunt, which I suppose was, will always be the biggest story of my career. And it was interesting, I heard about his case when the first week or two that I was in Winston-Salem. So a couple of reporters, when I'd first moved here, invited me up from Lexington for lunch and kind of for a tour around Winston-Salem. And so their version of a tour of Winston-Salem was to take me to crime scenes and then to go to that cafeteria that used to be near the airport called Bell Brothers, and I got introduced to sweet tea, pinto beans, and banana pudding. But the first place we went was right near the Journal, was this overgrown park where 3 years earlier, a copy editor at what was then the afternoon paper had been raped and stabbed to death. And so it was a crime that was still very, very fresh and recent. And they told me about it, and they told me, they had covered it, of course, and they told me about the arrest of a Black teenager named Daryl Hunt and his conviction, but that a lot of Black people in town thought that he'd been railroaded, and that people at the newspaper, were of two minds. They thought that there were some issues with the case, but they certainly weren't telling me, oh yeah, this guy's been railroaded. But they were telling me that this was a flashpoint in the city and an important case to know about because it would come up. And then we went off to, I don't remember the other crime scenes we went to. So jump ahead 19 years to 2003, no, not 19 years, 14 years to 2003. I'm 15 years, I can't do the math, 87 to 2003. I'm the city's metro columnist. By then, I'm one of the more senior members of the staff. And Daryl Hunt by then has had 2 trials in the Deborah Sykes case. He's been tried on another murder and acquitted. He's gone through years of appeals. All of this has been covered extensively by my colleagues at the paper. And he'd even had DNA testing in his case that excluded him as the rapist, but that was then the subject of all these ongoing appeals, and he was denied at every turn. And in 2003, he filed a motion asking for a new round of DNA testing so that the results could be run against what was then a new thing, these databases of convicted offenders. So that was a new thing in the early 2000s. And so another reporter wrote about, this motion he'd filed. And by then we had new editors at the paper. And the city editor had come, who had actually gone to graduate school with, had just joined he'd been there about a year, and he'd come from Connecticut where he'd worked on a case of wrongful conviction. So when he saw this short news story, he went and he pulled all the old files. And at the time, the newspaper had what we called the morgue, but it was a library. And all the old stories were, we had librarians who used to cut up the newspaper and file stories away, cross-referencing them, you know, murder and Daryl Hunt. So all these stories were there in these little manila envelopes. And my editor, Les Gura, I saw him reading all of them. And we also had a relatively new managing editor who'd been there maybe 2 or 3 years, who'd heard a lot about the Daryl Hunt case from basically from any black leader he ever encountered in Winston-Salem. And so he was kind of primed to take a fresh look at the case. And the Les Gura pushed for it. And so the next thing I knew, they took me off my column and said, oh, you know, we want you to look into this for a couple of months. And the couple of months turned into 6 months. And we ended up with a 8-part series that I wrote with the help of my editor as a narrative. So more the way a narrative means a story as opposed to a report. So character driven, each day ended with a cliffhanger. So, you know, like a Netflix series, except it was in a newspaper. And so the style of writing was, I mean, we'd written narrative pieces before, but they would have been features, not so much as a investigative news story. So the style of writing was new, and what I found was, well, I didn't find anything brand new because the story had been so deeply reported for so many years. The case had been so deeply reported. So any of the weaknesses with witnesses, with the chain of events, all these things had already been reported. But what I found that was new was when you put it all together, you could really see easily how deeply flawed the eyewitness evidence against Daryl Hunt was. And you could also see how deeply flawed the trial was, because I was able to piece together how the jury selection was done and how he ended up with a jury that was all white except for one black juror. I was able to really piece together what happens at the appellate level and how appeals courts are really set up for finality and how almost impossible it is. We think that the appellate courts are reviewing the facts, but they're really not. They're reviewing procedure, and the bar for a fresh look at the facts is so high that by the time, the 10 years into his case, when Daryl Hunt had DNA evidence that showed that he had not raped this copy editor, every appellate court said that, well, yeah, but there were still these witnesses and it wouldn't make any difference to a jury. That's not strong enough for a new trial. So when it was all pieced together into a narrative, and I kind of see you shaking your head, that was, when you put it all together, it was a very persuasive piece of reporting. And then the other thing that happened that was just this extraordinary set of circumstances that really had nothing to do with my reporting, but had to do with the paper taking it seriously and putting it out there, was of course it started running on a Sunday, and when I got to work Monday, I had all these voice messages, some of them, you know, half-baked cuckoo stuff, but there was a woman on the phone who said, "You have to call me, I know he's innocent. My name is Mary Lane, and the same man who raped Deborah Sykes raped my daughter-in-law, and I know it." And she had this kind of raspy voice. I called her. The first thing she said was, "You can't tell my daughter-in-law that I called." So it was really hard to sort out once my reporting was done. But I was able to track down this other rape I had tried to report on, but hadn't made much headway. But I was able to track it down enough. The police, pulled that file for me and told me about it. And they told me that the man that this other woman, whose name was Regina Lane, and she's agreed to be public so I can use her name, had identified, the computer showed that he'd been in prison the day that Deborah Sykes was murdered. So I wrote about it as a kind of missed opportunity. And that they should have tried to make more of a connection, that maybe she'd identified the wrong man, but I put it out there. And so what happened was, my series ran, I included this part about this other rape, and then kind of nothing happened. But we found out that that there'd been new DNA testing ordered by a local judge, and the State Bureau of Investigation was ignoring that court order. And so he threatened to hold them in contempt of court if they didn't follow his court order. So finally they did the DNA testing, and then it's very complicated to explain, they got a partial match to someone. And a partial match is meaningless. So they could have easily said, oh, we didn't get a match, because they didn't. But they got a partial match, and so they sent it to another crime lab in Alabama that somehow or other had better equipment than the crime lab in North Carolina. And Alabama looked at it and they said, this is a partial match, but it's so close, you should look at this guy's brothers. And one of the brothers was Willard Brown, who that second rape victim had identified. And the police had pulled all those files, and they also knew that I knew his name. I mean, they knew that the newspaper was kind of on it. It would have been really hard to not move forward with it at that point. And then, by another coincidence, Willard Brown was in the county jail that week on probation violation. And so, then it was out of a movie. They gave him a cigarette, he dropped the butt on the ground, they picked it up, they tested it, and bingo, it matched the DNA from that rape from what was then 19 years ago. And so Willard Brown was arrested, and Darrell Hunt was released from prison, and then he was exonerated a few months later. And the other thing that my work, or the newspaper's work, accomplished was that the judge read it, which he was so outraged after reading it that that's what led him to threaten the state crime lab to hold them in contempt of court. And Tom Keith, who was the current DA, who hadn't prosecuted it originally, but he was defending the prosecution, read it, and it turned out he'd never actually read the case files. Well, the case files were voluminous, so I suppose that's why he never read them. And he read it, and he was also eventually persuaded, not by his own work, but by the work in the newspaper. And so he did not oppose he joined with Darrell Hunt's attorney to ask for the exoneration.
Wow. Okay. I'm gonna.
That's a lot. I mean, it's a lot to.
Well, we're gonna back up a little bit.
Yeah.
There, but I want to zoom in a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, so that gave it a great overview
Yeah.
of the whole lengthy narrative.
Right.
Um, and just to back up a little bit, I had moved to this city around that time.
Mm-hmm.
We got married, my wife and I got married in, well, I better remember this one, 2003.
Mm-hmm.
And the series ran when?
November.
Of that year?
Uh-huh.
Wow. And so, and by that time, how long had Daryl been in prison?
He'd been in prison for 19 years. He was arrested in September of 1984. He was convicted in 1985. He was out for a year on bond when he had a new trial. So.
How old was he in 85, roughly? I mean,
He was 20. He was arrested at 19. So he was a teenager he was not a teenager when he was convicted, but he was a teenager when he was arrested.
Right. And so, one thing I'd like to know is, once you began in 2000, so you actually began writing the series in 2003?
Right.
And it took you about
6 months.
6 months of research.
Exactly. I started in April 2003 and it published in November.
And when was the first time you actually met with Daryl Hunt?
It was sometime in June of 2003, June or July. I think it was June. We went to see him in prison in Salisbury, North Carolina, Piedmont Correctional Institute. And I hope I'm remembering this all right. I think I only interviewed him the one time before his release.
What was it like meeting him?
Yeah.
After all these reports.
Yeah. So I was really clear in my head that I was going into this project with an open mind. I wasn't going into it as a crusader who was going to get Daryl Hunt out of prison. I was going into it as a neutral person who was going to try to figure out what had happened in this case and evaluate the evidence and evaluate the case. So I was not emotionally engaged with meeting him. And we had some tough questions for him. And also I'd never been in a prison before, so that was kind of, that's a shocking experience. But so I remember, and I went with my editor and his lawyer. And so, it's just kind of shocking to go into a prison and then you're locked in there. They take your stuff and you can bring I don't think we brought a tape recorder. I don't think we were allowed. We brought, a pad and pens, and that was kind of it. And then they take you into the visitation room, and it's just, fluorescent lights and, table and vending machines. And, I suppose there's a guard standing somewhere. And, then they bring Daryl Hunt in, and he's cuffed. I don't remember if I think he's cuffed and his legs are, anyway, he's not free. And, he was really gracious. He was thoughtful. He had this kind of telegraphic memory, so he remembered details of things. It was always kind of uncanny and strange. So, we asked him to recount. I don't remember the way the interview unfolded, but he was I think he was a little suspicious, like you would be, but he was very gracious, very mild-mannered. He had a really good rapport with his lawyer, Mark Rabel, so you could pick up on all that warmth and affection and everything. Because of course by then they'd known each other for 19 years. what else was it like? He was very direct. And then we'd saved what our big like coup was. Thinking back, it was kind of stupid, but the top editors really wanted it. They wanted something that was going to be like new. So like at the very end, we asked him if he would take a lie detector test. That was like our, you know, not nice question. And the thing was, he instantly said, sure, I'll do anything. And then his lawyer jumped in and said, we'll have to talk about it. I don't think so. Because, of course, lie detector tests are not reliable. And I don't really even remember why that was so important to the paper, except we wanted something that was going to add some new piece of information. But what really stuck out was his immediate willingness to do it. And he didn't look to, he didn't hesitate. He didn't look to Mark Rabel and say, oh, I don't know, I'll have to ask my lawyer. His gut response was, sure, I'll do whatever, of course. But I don't remember having a lot of like feeling for him, one way or the other. I liked him, but.
I mean, as a reporter, it is necessary to maintain some distance from people.
Yeah, I don't know that I would still maintain that kind of distance, but at the time, I thought it was really important, and I thought it was really important for this story also, because people in Winston-Salem had such strong views about it that a story that was sort of super sympathetic to Darryl Hunt, white people would not have wanted to read. It wouldn't have worked as so. I mean, I wrote about Darryl Hunt, and it was sympathetic, but it really was not an 8-part series about Darryl Hunt. It was an 8-part series about the case.
Right. I'm going to move in just a little bit tighter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Just check focus. Okie dokie. Wow. There's so many things to cover.
Yes.
And let's speaking about people's strong feelings, take us back a little bit about the black community's response and people like Larry Little and so from the get-go, they were convinced that this was bullshit, or however you want to put it. I mean, the case was wrong.
Yeah, so I don't, I appreciate your phrase, the black community, but I don't like to use it because, of course, there were some black people who weren't persuaded, but who didn't champion his cause. I mean, it's not this monolithic thing, but very early on, Darryl Hunt attracted support from people who in the community who knew him, in the neighborhood that he hung around in. And one of the people who he knew from the neighborhood was a city council, well, they were called aldermen at the time, Larry Little, who was a big civil rights figure in Winston-Salem. He had founded the Black Panther Party in the Winston-Salem chapter of the Black Panther Party, and then after that disbanded, he'd become a city alderman. He was very active with voter registration. He was active with other civil rights criminal kinds of cases in North Carolina that preceded Darryl Hunt's case, including a case out of Eastern North Carolina, the Joanne Little case, that was a black woman who was who was in jail and was attacked, sexually assaulted by the guard, and she killed him, and she was arrested for murder, and this all happened in the 70s, and she was miraculously acquitted. And so Larry Little had been steeped in all of this kind of activism. But he knew Daryl Hunt from the neighborhood. They played basketball together. And just from knowing him, he just didn't believe that Daryl Hunt could have been capable of that kind of a brutal sexual assault and stabbing death. And so he started looking into it, and he had sources. And then he started working with Daryl Hunt's defense attorney, and he started a defense committee. And early on, it was just, women and some men, mostly older women, who knew Daryl Hunt from the neighborhood and, just didn't believe that he was that kind of person. And they also understood what the kind of hysteria that kind of crime produces in, I could say the South, but I'm not going to. I think it produces that kind of hysteria in the entire country. But when a white woman is raped and then murdered, and witnesses had seen her with a black man, and it turned out she was raped and murdered by a black man, that creates the kind of hysteria that's been used in our country since the beginning of time to drum up fears about black men and to punish black people. And it really doesn't matter whether a particular person actually committed the crime or not. It's the same hysteria that led to lynch mobs. And so black people who knew Daryl Hunt, this 19-year-old, he was homeless at the time. He was good friends with this other guy from the neighborhood, and they just knew him as a sweet, thoughtful, kind person. And they also understood what was happening, and they understood that if this white woman had been murdered, they were just going to get the first black guy they could pin it on, and that's what happened, and they were right. And so it was the neighborhood people understood the whole social, historical, cultural dynamic that was at work in this case.
Well, yeah, I just remember when I read the series.
Mm-hmm.
I was relatively new, but
Mm-hmm.
I've been in Greensboro for a while, and I was really moved by it deeply, and I felt it was horrible. It read as such a powerful narrative. That's what stuck out in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But talk a little bit about what the local, having read your book, which we'll
Yeah.
get to a little
Mm-hmm.
bit. The police. In your book you talk about how openly racist they were. Like when they finally charged him, they were
Sure.
using the N-word and all that.
Yeah. So when I worked on the series, I didn't know any of that. What I knew was, what I saw was tunnel vision and confirmation bias and lots of incompetence early on, and then people who were then attached to unwilling to look at things with fresh eyes. I didn't know, I suspected that there was racism, but I didn't see any evidence of it, and obviously that kind of stuff doesn't show up in police reports. So what I saw it more as structural racism and bias, and the original series talked a lot about implicit bias and subconscious bias in the way witnesses identify suspects from lineups and how white people have a hard time recognizing black people and so on. But later, when I started researching a book that I just finished earlier this year, I learned a lot more about how overtly racist the police were. And I learned that from a couple of sources. First of all, I learned it from Daryl Hunt's journals. So he wrote about these things that people said to him. I learned about it from after he was exonerated, the city appointed a commission of citizens to go back and look at what went wrong, basically. And they assigned 2 police officers to go back and look at everything once again. And one of the police officers, both were detectives, one was a black detective, the other was a white detective. And so I learned from the black detective about the overt racism he faced when he was a rookie and was in training, and just kind of the things he perceived, he saw in the way other patrol officers even thought about what it was to go into black neighborhoods to patrol. Yeah, they used to play a song to like get themselves pumped up. It was a Guns N' Roses song about the jungle. I don't remember how it went. So, but all of that I learned later on. The thing that really clinched this idea that there was overt racism was that one of the things that came out in this city review was I suppose it was in some police files. I don't know if it was in court files. I think it was in police files. There were these notes that the police made during Daryl Hunt's second trial. The police go to watch the trial too because they're called to testify. And they had made notes, like keeping like a scorecard of all the witnesses. And there was a column that said P and another column that said N. So clearly it was check for the police, check for the N-word. And there were like these little scribbles, doodles, and with like figures with like ape. I don't know what they were. They looked like apes or something. But it was clearly overt racism. But I didn't know anything about that when I was first looking at it.
So things had changed when you were writing the series from 1985 when he was arrested.
I don't know. I don't know how much they've changed. There are things people don't talk among themselves totally differently than they would talk in front of a newspaper reporter.
Right.
I think things have changed now, but with our police department. But policing there's a lot of systemic racism in policing all over the country. So
yeah, no doubt.
So I don't know how much things have changed.
Yeah, unfortunately, we seem to be going the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Well, so okay. I mean, I think you've covered. Let's talk a little bit of. I mean, somebody I want to definitely interview, Mark Rabel, a little bit about that, because as a story, here's a young, relatively inexperienced attorney,
right,
taking on this huge case. I mean, what was it like working, with him? I mean,
yeah. So, so when I first started, in 2003, Mark Rabel was incredibly helpful, but I think also suspicious. I think everybody in Daryl Hunt's camp thought, okay, we're going to help her out and see what they come up with, but it's probably going to be nothing, I think was the attitude, but we'll give her a try. And I was pretty well respected among black officials, black leaders, black community activists in Winston-Salem because of other work that I'd done. So I had some credibility. Um, so he was, he was very helpful, but I didn't really get to know him because he was also a little bit suspicious of me and also sort of staying super neutral. But what I've learned since then, I mean, he and I have become friends. We teach together at Wake Forest, and then I interviewed him extensively for the book that I just wrote. So what I've come to understand is, the case consumed him for 20 years of his life, and then he had a 12-year friendship with Darryl Hunt, and then Darryl Hunt's, that consumed him. And he ended up doing all capital work for a period of time, and now he teaches at Wake Forest and he runs the Innocence Clinic. So it completely changed the trajectory of his professional life. And it changed his understanding of racism and white privilege, all those I suppose, changed the way he sees the world, really. Now, a part of the story that we didn't get to that is so critical that I'm realizing as I'm talking about Mark Rabel is that after Darryl Hunt was released from prison and exonerated, he got into social justice work. And there was a documentary made about him that made him, kind of famous. And so he became a national advocate for criminal justice reform. He worked on all kinds of reform in North Carolina, especially having to do with the death penalty and the racism in the death penalty system. He advocated strongly for a law in North Carolina that's called the Racial Justice Act that allows people on death row to appeal their sentence if they can show a pattern of racial bias in the system, so they don't have to prove that the prosecutor or a particular juror in their case was racist. They can prove racial bias systemically, and which is essentially everybody on death row now, all 135, or almost everybody, has an appeal pending under that act, which is essentially why we haven't had an execution in North Carolina in more than 15 years. And a lot of that was because of Darryl Hunt getting that law passed, because his story and his charisma when he would go and testify about his trial and how he was almost sentenced to death and how the jury selection had been so blatantly racist, and the racism that he faced during his case, he was such a compelling human being that that his testimony was very moving to legislators. So he did that kind of work. He also started a foundation and worked. What he really cared about was people coming home from prison, even if they had committed the crimes they were serving their time on. And so he did a lot of work one-on-one with people coming home from prison, with reentry work, helping people find jobs, but also kind of serving as a source. People now call it social capital. But if you come out of prison and you don't know people, and you don't know people who have wealth, you're kind of, the hurdles are so huge. And so that's what he was working on in his life. But he also was battling demons. And one thing that people in this innocence movement are just beginning to talk about is the trauma associated with wrongful conviction and with prison, the psychological damage that's done. And so all these people, we read about them almost every day now. Somebody gets out of prison, they're exonerated. and we think, hooray, the system finally worked, justice has finally been done. And a large number of people who've been through that kind of experience kind of never get over it. And that's essentially what happened to Darryl Hunt. And his personal life fell apart, all kinds of things fell apart for him. It turned out he was using drugs, opiates, and in 2016 he killed himself. He took his own life, he shot himself. He had borrowed Larry Little's truck. Well, things had fallen apart, so his cars had been repossessed, so he was using Larry Little's truck and staying with a girlfriend, and part of the time with Larry Little, part of the time with the girlfriend, and then he just went missing in March of 2016, and he was found dead March 13th, 2016, on a big street in Winston-Salem, right across from the Coliseum, in a parking lot, you know, in a strip center. And so when we were talking about Mark Rabel, you know, it was devastating, I mean, obviously devastating for all the people who cared so much about Darryl and had worked so hard on his behalf. To have it end like that was just devastating. And obviously devastating for Mark, because it was kind of his life's work, and they had a friendship that was, you know, very, very deep. I mean, they cared so much for each other, and it was devastating for Larry Little. And for Darryl was divorced by then from his wife, April Hunt, but they were divorced, but still really close. So it was devastating for her.
Yeah, so it's really tragic. Of course, funny, some people still feel like he didn't kill himself. I mean, that's been
Yes.
Out there.
Yes.
You know.
I didn't know you had heard that too,
Yeah.
but some people feel like he didn't kill himself. The medical examiner, you know, worked really hard. I mean, she went above and beyond because she knew that that would be the reaction. He had told people that he had stage 4 cancer, and she found no evidence of cancer. She ordered his medical records. He wasn't getting treated for cancer. He had an incision, but it turned out the operation he'd had was for a hernia. So yeah, there was no evidence of cancer. And she ruled it as a suicide. It was a contact wound to the belly. The gun would have been positioned towards his heart, so he died instantly. The doors were locked. The truck had been left on and had run out of gas, and I don't think there was any evidence of, you know, a struggle. But I know there are people, including Mark Rabel, who don't completely, who either don't believe it was suicide or who still have questions about it.
Interesting. Wow. Yeah, I mean, we could go on for hours about the case and many different aspects. People, Willard Brown, there was that horrible guy who was a snitch, like early on in the case.
Right.
Kind of fingered him.
Right.
Who was very dubious in character.
Totally dubious, yeah. Johnny Gray.
But I think you've covered the case pretty well. Is there anything else you want to add about Darryl Hunt?
No, except well, it's just so sad. And I mean, what drew me back into his story that, you know, I thought I was kind of done with was just this sense that, yeah, it was the sense that as a journalist and a writer, I had kind of missed the story. So I'd written the story of the case. I'd never really looked at how all of this had affected him and what had really happened to him in prison and what does prison do to people and what is the history of our prison system. And I'd never really explored those subjects and never really, I thought about it in the way you would if you're, a half-conscious person, but I had never really looked at how all of that played out in his life. And I felt like I didn't feel like I had personally let him down. I don't think there was anything Phoebe Zerwick would have done if I'd really known how much he was suffering. But I felt that as a journalist, or I felt that I hadn't really seen him for who he was, and that a lot of other people had not really seen him. That we wanted to see him as he'd sort of become this poster boy for social justice, and I think that or people just wanted him to be this courageous advocate and didn't really see how much he was struggling. And I don't think he had been fully seen. And I suppose, that's true of, we don't see people for who they are in all realms of our culture, but certainly if you live in a well-off side of town, you don't really see the other side of town or we don't see people for who they are. It's just really easy to pigeonhole people, right? Well, that's true, that's why our politics is so divided right now. This has nothing to do with Daryl Hunt, but we see the label. We see, oh, they're a right-wing extremist. Oh, they're a liberal. Oh, they're an academic. Oh, they're a factory worker. We don't actually really see people for who they are, how they're individuals, how they're unique, what they think, why they think what they think. That's a tangent, but
no, we dehumanize people.
Yeah.
Certainly, especially black men who've been in prison or vilified constantly.
Absolutely.
In the media and out there.
But not even just in the media. Certainly in the media. I'm not trying to make excuses for the media, but black men who've been in prison have an impossible time getting a job because we're so afraid of crime and protecting ourselves that, we don't want to hire somebody who's been in prison to work in our restaurant or build our house or do whatever. Answer the phone, whatever.
Right. Okay, I think there's so many questions in terms of, being a participant observer. You helped on some level. What you did was immensely helpful on a lot of levels, not only to Daryl Hunt, but to justice, I think, in terms of some things you've already mentioned in terms of how, there have been some changes even in this state in terms of the death penalty and that
Sure,
kind of stuff.
yeah.
And then, the intersection between journalism as advocacy or as, and you're a real journalist, so it's not propaganda. This is all true stuff.
Right.
But what about that as journalism? They used to call it muckraking back.
Yeah.
Back in the day, exposed Sinclair
Right.
Lewis, The Jungle.
Right.
What about all that? In other words, there was, the fourth. Is that what they call it? The fourth estate.
Yeah, the fourth estate. Yeah. So journalism. Yeah. So journalism is in crisis in so many ways right now. So first of all, we call it the media landscape, but it's so fragmented. So people don't read the same thing, and people don't trust the media. Liberals don't trust the media, conservatives don't trust the media. The media is this term that encompasses so much. People get their news from such a range of sources, and people, there isn't this kind of common accepted set of facts anymore. So when you and I were coming up, there was the newspaper, there were the local newspapers, there was network news, and that was kind of it. That's where people, and Time and Newsweek. And now everybody gets their news from a range of sources. Some of it is factual, verified journalism. If you get your news on social media, it's really hard to tell the difference, right? If you don't have the New York Times in front of you or the Winston-Salem Journal, you just got your Twitter feed. How do you know what you're looking at unless you go to the original source and look at it very carefully? So that's one problem, this fragmentation. The other problem is that we've lost so much journalism. I mean, I don't remember the figures, but we've lost about half the newspapers in the country, and they're the ones that are left, except for the big national ones like the New York Times, which is thriving, and the Washington Post, which is thriving. Everything is cut in half or by a third or diminished. So the Winston-Salem Journal, they don't have an environmental reporter anymore. They don't have a dedicated healthcare reporter anymore. They don't have anybody. They have a court reporter, Michael Hewlett, who does a really good job, but they don't have, they can't set him loose for 6 months because they have nobody else to fill the news pages. So there's less reporting happening. Now, and when there's less reporting, what's really happening is just recycling the same stuff over and over again, and there's a lot of opinion writers and a lot of bloggers and a lot of pundits. So it's people putting their own spin on the same stories that keep getting recycled. Now, there's a lot of promising stuff happening in journalism now. There's a lot of nonprofit news sites that are springing up. There is great reporting still happening at local newspapers, but there's just not enough of it, and nobody has yet. Maybe these sort of nonprofit sites that have sprung up will really flourish, and to me it's too soon to tell, but nobody has really come up with an economic model to replace the way news organizations used to make money, which was classified ads and retail ads and all of that, which is, now you don't have to pay to advertise something, you just put it on Craigslist or go out on Facebook or something. And so nothing has replaced that economic model that used to pay the salaries of all the people I went to work with every day 30 years ago with the Winston-Salem Journal. And there just aren't enough of us.
Right. Okay, I'm gonna do one. Okay. Check focus.
And I'd say I have a good half hour left.
Yeah, well, I think we're moving towards closure.
Okay,
here.
okay.
It's been a great interview, really.
We could talk a little bit more about advocacy journalism if you want.
Well, I want to, what I'm looking at is how to, in other words, people say, okay, well now, here we have part of the thing with the Unsung Heroes Project, we're looking for people like you, you know, I mean, who are not, you're a journalist, and yet what you did affected our society.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, whether you're a journalist, or it could be a minister, or
Right.
a lawyer.
Right.
My friend Jasper Brown with the National Labor Relations Board, what
Uh-huh.
he did, because that affected things. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, even though he wasn't Benjamin, that Crump gentleman who, who's been defending all the people, all these horrible cases like Breonna Taylor.
Oh,
He's that
right.
attorney who's,
Right.
but, you know, so I think the intersection between journalism and however you want to call it, the civil rights movement or the human rights movement or justice.
Yeah. So,
what journalism's job is to uncover these stories, or as part of the job,
yeah.
as an investigative reporter. And so, but I think, when you took on the assignment, you weren't thinking in those terms. You were thinking, okay, we're going to look at this case and.
Well, I mean, the reason I got into journalism, apart from the fact that I hated being a bureaucrat, but the reason I got into journalism was because I believed all that stuff that we always used to say about journalism. You shine a light in the dark places, and when darkness is exposed, good can come about. That the job of a journalist is to, wait, let me get it right, afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. The job of journalists is to bear witness. I mean, that was what was always motivating me, was to uncover things that weren't working, that had gone wrong, and in the belief that once these problems were exposed, that we would find a way to fix them. So it's kind of a, okay, I'm going to wax on a little bit. It's because I get very upset by the way patriotism has been co-opted by people whose values I don't share. But essentially, that kind of journalism is a patriotic act because it rests on the belief that we live in a country that wants to do what's right, and that government ultimately is a source of solutions, or that our institutions are a source of solutions, and that the role of journalists or the fourth estate is to expose things that aren't working so that they can be fixed. So, it sounds like it's always, poking and exposing and being antagonistic, but it rests on the belief that American institutions can and will ultimately do right and fix things. Which, it has somewhere in there some belief in, it's not a nihilistic way of thinking about things. Like if you expose something that's wrong in the justice system, you do that somewhere in the belief that the justice system can correct itself. If you expose something that's wrong with, the way election boards are operating, it's on the belief that they can be fixed. So yeah, that would be why I and most people I know who got into journalism got into it.
So in a weird way, telling the truth is a form of advocacy for the truth, or advocacy.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I'm a little uncomfortable with the idea of advocacy journalism, because I really think you've got to go into a story without an agenda, without a preconceived idea. So I think some sites that build themselves, some organizations that build themselves as advocacy journalists do a great job, but I'm not comfortable with that label for myself, and I don't know that I'm that comfortable with it.
Right, because the truth, in terms of telling I mean, the true story, and then of course people can interpret the truth or whatever, but, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing that I think my understanding of journalism has changed, and not just me, but a lot of journalists I know, is, we used to think that we were going to try to be objective, and I think that that's a false goal. Like, none of us is objective. We all come into whatever situation we're in with our own views and our own life experience and our own biases. But I think that what I try to do, and other journalists I know are trying to do, is to have an objective method, understand your own biases and guard against them. And then I think where I've changed is I think journalists need to be way more transparent about their methods and how they go about reporting a story, and sharing, if you're using data, share the data. If to just be more transparent about the method, because the public has such distrust of all journalists now. Although interestingly, when polling is done, the public still trusts their local news source. It's the big guys they don't trust.
They're the bad guys.
Yeah, but I think that the polling shows that the public still trusts local news.
Well, now, when the series came out in 2003, what were some of the responses from different aspects of the black community?
Yeah.
Had very little,
Oh, he was really happy with it. I think he was surprised that we'd taken such a close look, and surprised that I think he was both happy and irritated that it had taken so long. But he was really happy with it. I think I've told this story a million times, but the most interesting reaction I got was after the series ran and before the testing was done. My dryer broke and I had to go and buy a new dryer, so I went to Sears, and I'm not the kind of person who does a lot of research on this kind of thing. So I just went in there and I said to the sales guy, I need a dryer. I don't want the most expensive and I don't want the cheapest. I want something in the middle, so show me a good dryer. I was like, I just need to get this over with. And so I bought the dryer, and I gave him my credit card, and he said, "Oh, Phoebe Zerwick, are you the same Phoebe Zerwick who writes for the newspaper?" And I said, "Well, yeah, of course." It's not a very common name. And he said, when I saw you were writing about Daryl Hunt, he said, I wasn't even going to bother to read it. He said, I've known about that case for 20 years. I couldn't understand why the paper was digging up all that old history. He said, but I started reading it and I couldn't put it down. He said, I read every word you wrote. And he said, now I'm not so sure. Maybe he didn't do it. So that seemed really profound to me, that just like a average white guy who thought that Daryl Hunt was guilty, because that's what he'd been reading for 20 years, had changed their mind. And yeah, that seemed really, really profound to me.
Absolutely. Quite moving.
Yeah, it was moving. And what he was moved by was the style of the writing, that he kept reading, and he found something to read. He found something there that he thought he knew, that was a different way of looking at something.
Well, that must have been quite motivating to you to hear that from somebody out of the blue, and then just
unsolicited.
Unsolicited.
Yeah. And it told me a lot about. I suppose it told me a lot about how help people see things in a new way. You know, if you can cut through, I mean, our media landscape is so, and our political discourse, everything is just so filled with just all like this shouting and this rhetoric. And I mean, rhetoric is not a bad word, I teach rhetoric, but all this just shouting past each other. But when people actually can take the time to look at something that actually happened, they can change their mind.
So you open up people's minds, black and white,
Yeah, I hope so.
to that story.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
and I hope the book does that too, and in a different way. I mean, it's not a book that's trying to show people in Daryl Hunt's hometown that he was wrongly convicted. It's a book that's trying to take people through an individual story into our criminal legal system, into prison, into what happens when somebody is denied justice, and into a world that they don't know, so that they can see things differently.
yeah, I was so struck by, in the book, how many different prisons he was sent to over the years, and some of the prisons up in the rural area, a lot of them were,
Yeah.
you know, or more up in the mountains towards, you know, Asheville, where they were all, you know, white. You know, that was a scary thing.
Yeah.
The level of racism on the part of a lot of the guards and white inmates, and the fact that, you know, what he went through, worrying about being killed pretty much all the time.
Yeah.
And what that does to somebody to live in that level of anxiety and fear, you know, that really brought home that, you know, I think that was such, well, for me, I mean, the whole book is an amazing achievement. And, you know,
well, what you're talking about was new to me too, you know, to piece that together and to really try to put myself in his shoes, and to understand just what you said, what it does to you to live with that constant level of fear and anxiety for all that time.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one big thing for me in all these interviews is empathy. How, you know, how a lot of the forces of, you know, honestly, not taking the whole thing about it, but in terms of Fox News and this hate that's being stirred up, like, on a pretty overt level these days, kind of
Right.
shocking, you know. You know, and then how people get dehumanized and how we're so polarized, and so, you know, empathy as from one. How can we get some of that empathy back that's being pushed down or pushed away by the forces of hatred?
Yeah.
Is I think one reason why what you do and what journalists do, and, you know, documentary people and all that, to try to, you know, tell stories that can help us have empathy for other people, and not, you know, get swept up in the how easy it is and seductive in a way it is to, you know, as the Sears guy did for a long time, just figure, well, he did it, you know.
Sure.
So, you know, I think that's one reason. What I'm trying to say somewhat clumsily is how important storytelling and narratives are, so that we can try to maintain our humanity as humans. You know, I don't know if there any.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. There's that great line, which I of course can't remember, by Hannah Arendt, you know, who wrote about totalitarianism. That's all about the power of narrative as the force to stand. I'm stealing the idea, and then I'm mutilating her words, but it's basically that the power of narrative to stand against totalitarianism. That narrative is so powerful in the face of the forces that try to, turn people into the other, right? And you can't annihilate people who you have empathy with, but if you demonize them or dehumanize them, then you can do whatever you want, right?
Right.
So, yeah, in a small way, I mean, I don't want to over-romanticize the power of journalism or overly glorify it, but communities, I mean, there's been so much study done of local news and what happens when you lose local news, and what happens when you have strong local news. So in communities that have lost local news, there's less civic engagement, less political engagement, less engagement with schools. I mean, and when people know what's happening in their communities and they know their neighbors, or at least they've read about them and they read about what's happening in schools and other neighborhoods, and then they begin to care about them again. And that has to do with not just with information, it has to do with information, but also with story and storytelling.
Yeah. Well, I think we should probably wrap it up.
Okay.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? I mean, in terms of, I think we've covered a lot of the. I think it's a terrific interview, and I think. Is there anything else you want to say?
No, I think we've covered it. I mean, I think that there are, part of the subject is community and empathy. I mean, there's so many ways of forging that sense of belonging and that sense of connection, and I think that's fundamentally what people crave. And if they don't get that that sense of belonging in a way that is about community and empathy, then people will get it somewhere else, right? And so you can either belong to a movement that's going to, overthrow the Capitol, or you can, belong to your community and care about your school system and care about your neighbors and care about understand why we have so many Hispanic people here who might not be here legally, right? If you understand who they are, then you're not going to be afraid of them, right? And there are many ways of doing that, but journalism is a really powerful way of helping people understand each other.
Okay. Well, with that, as they say, it's a wrap.
Okay.